The Georgian poets. The decadent conception of poetry could not survive long, and by 1900, the search for a mere natural type of verse had already begun. It resulted in the poetry of Georgian school, much of which appeared in the 5 volumes of Georgian poetry published between 1912 to 1922. The Georgian poetry was so called because George V was the king presiding over the destiny of British Empire. The poets who figured prominently in these volumes were Gordon Bottomley, Rupert Brooke, G.K. Chesterton, W.H. Davis, Walter de la Mare, John Drinkwater, Faulkner, W. Gibbon, D.H. Lawrence, John Masefield, Ronald Ross, Robert Graves, Freeman, and Edward Shanks. These poets treated natural things in a clear, natural, and beautiful way. In their treatment of nature and social life, they discarded the use of archaic diction such as thee and thou and eschewed such poetical construction as winter drear and host on armed host. They dropped all gorgeous and grandiloquent expressions and generally avoided such properties of thought and expression. In reaction to Victorian Victorianism, their verse avoided all formally religious, philosophic, or improving things. And in reaction to decadent poets of the 90s, they avoided all subjects that smacked of sadness, wickedness, and cafe table. Their subjects were to be nature, love, leisure, old age, childhood, animals, sleep, unemotional subjects. The Georgian poets wrote extremely neat and very melodious poems about sheep, bird, cow, and other domestic or wild animals. They also celebrated in pleasing verse the charms of various localities in the British Isles. Quietly, they longed for the good old days and ways. These poets had clearly recognizable individual qualities but were alike in the rejection of the ideas of the decadents. Their quest for simplicity and reality and their love for natural beauty. In their own way, they were escapist because they show little awareness of the industrial world around them. John Masefield is the poet of the people, and the poetry is surcharged with democratic sympathy for the downtrodden. He very beautifully combined realism with romance and beauty. His love for nature and the countryside is well presented in Renard the Fox and Right Royal. He is the laureate of the sea, and few poets have been able to capture the atmosphere of the sea, the ships, the sailors as vividly as he has done in Dunbar and Sea Fever. He poured new life into English narrative verse. The Everlasting Mercy is the first great narrative poem of Masefield. Walter de la Mare. Among the distinguished poets of the Georgian period, Walter de la Mare stands on a high pedestal. He is essentially the laureate of the fairyland, creating in his poetry a world of dreams, fantasies, and imagination, appealing to children as well as the grown up people. In Westerners and other poems, the fleeting and other poems, collected poems, bells and gross, the traveler, we have the West of Walter de la Mare's poetic genius. But he is by profession a children's poet. He has very successfully captured the spirit of childhood. His child poetry exhibits an astonishing variety. It contains nursery rhymes, stories, and songs. Walter de la Mare is a master artist and a superb craftsman in verse. Edmund Blunder is essentially a poet of nature and pastoral life. In his early verses, he had the gifts of the Georgians, but later on, his opinions reacted against the Georgians. He started writing about the horrors of war, but again he turned his gaze back to the peace and beauty of nature. His best work is to be found in English poems, Sands by a Stream and After the Bombing. His poems of English countryside are to be seen in the face of England, English villages, and cricket country. Flaker. Flaker is the master of jeweled phrase and gem-like verse. He delights in the very names of exotic things and distant places, and master as he is of dazzling phrase and supple rhythm. He seldom fails to evoke an answering delight in the reader. He takes everything with a certain gaiety and irony. In my exotic poem, he says, I feel that there should be most vigilant humor in the poem and parade of nicely chosen words. The main bulk of Flaker's poetry is to be found in The Breeze of Fire, the West Generation, 42 poems, and The Old Ships. W. W. Gibbon. His poetry reveals three phases and three stages. The first is imitative and romantic. The second is noted for its stern realism mingled with a feeling of humanitarianism. The last phase is characterized by mellowness and philosophic serenity rising out of his observation of human life. It is, however, by the work of his second period that Gibbon will be remembered in the future age to come. The second period of Gibbon's poetic career is that of a realist. He is interested in the problems of industrial life and factory workers. In the poems published in Deliberate, there is an aim of greenness and bleakness. W. H. Davis. He is essentially a poet of lyricism. His lyrics are short and spontaneous. Much of Davies' lyricism is marked with a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. He is the poet of nature and pastoral life. He presents the sights and scenes of nature as well as the incoherent country people. But he is not mystical and metaphysical in his approach to nature. He is not concerned with discovering and philosophy behind the scenes of nature. He simply presents the sights of nature in their freshness. His poems are symbol of simplicity and artlessness. There is lack of depth and profundity in his poetry. Among his volumes of verses are The Soul's Destroyer and other poems. new poems, collected poems, and love poems. Edward Thomas is essentially a poet of nature and resembles the Georgians in his love for countryside and natural simplicity. He sang as though he were the only and the first poet, and there was conscious literary effort in the choice of material. I must go down to the seas, again to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer by. Thank you.